Hey students, we're going to be completing our chapter 16 lesson on economic interdependence and how has growing economic interdependence changed the spatial relationships among the people in the world. Okay, for this slide, guys, you're going to need the book. So if you don't have the book, pause this and go get your book. We're going to turn to page 268. And then after you've turned to page 268, you're going to be looking at the section that's above the title. So there's a title, The Changing Global Economy. You're going to be looking above that title. And that whole section is about how, oil prices were low in 2014, which sounds like it's great. Like we want oil prices to be low. We want to go fill up our car and have the prices to be low. That's great for us, right? And so it seems like it's just a win-win. But in reality, it's a win-lose. It's a win for us, but it's a lose for somebody else. And so that's what I want you guys to consider for a few minutes is how one thing happening that could cause an economic change somewhere is going to change many things around the globe, and we don't really understand what they're going to be until it happened. So if you're looking at page 268 and you're looking at the bulleted sections, it talks about how oil prices declining is obviously great for consumers. And it's going to be great for consumers in a lot of countries that are not oil producing. And so those consumers are able to go and buy more things, spend more money on other things besides gas. Maybe they can go out to dinner more, they can buy more clothes or albums or whatever. So it is going to stimulate the economy on those other things. But if your economy is totally dependent on oil, or a large part of your economy is dependent on oil, it can be economically devastating. And I've talked to you guys before about Venezuela. That is what happened there in Venezuela. They were really, really devastated by this. So if you look at the list on page 268, it just gives you a little summary in the bulleted points of all the things that were negative that happened. So you have oil companies losing revenue, and Shell in Netherlands. So it's a huge company in Netherlands. Their earnings fell by 80%. So obviously the people in the Netherlands, which is in Europe, in Northern Europe, next to Germany, they're going to really suffer. And then we have people who worked in the oil industry who lost their jobs, a lot of people. And then oil dependent countries like Venezuela would have a huge economic downturn as they would have to reduce public services because they're taking in less money. And also a lot of those employees are going to be laid off. And then coal companies could not compete with the lower cost. So the cost was so low because both coal and oil provide energy. And so the cost for oil was so low that coal's like, we can't produce it cheap enough. It just isn't going to work for us. So they are going to reduce their costs. And then you saw energy industry investors saw losses as well. So there's some people who invest a lot in, oil, and they're going to lose a lot of money as well. So there's always a downside. And so that's something to really consider when we have this global economy, when we're all so connected. The reverberations of one action or one problem or even one boom can be felt all around the globe. So this is a map of the International Division of Labor and how different countries provide different sectors of the economy. So you have the countries, the ones that in the lightest blue, they are pretty much working in the primary sector, so doing a lot of mining especially. Those are going to be mining, some farming, but mostly mining sectors. So their primary sector, so their primary sector being mining. And then in the darkest blue, those are countries, we talked about them before, that are newly industrialized countries. And these countries are working primarily, their biggest push is in the secondary sector, so a lot of it in manufacturing. Okay, so those countries are known as the semi periphery. The countries in the light blue are known as the periphery. And then the core countries would be the ones where they're working primarily in the tertiary, quaternary, quinary sector. So, what is that? Tertiary service. And then service can be broken down into two other types of service, which is quaternary, research and development, and quinary, that would be your top leaders in business or in government. Okay. So all of the countries are interwoven and working together just in different parts of the same economy. So the economy is all connected. And just to note, one reason that a lot of manufacturing is done in these semi periphery countries and mining is done in these periphery countries is because a lot of these countries don't have labor rules and they don't have environmental protection rules. For example, there is a country in Africa. I really need to look it up because I forgot. But a country in Africa where they do mining for a metal that, or mineral, I should say, that goes into a metal, that goes into the batteries that power a lot of rechargeable things, like, cars, electric cars, and also our phones that are rechargeable. And that mining is done by children, like upper elementary age children. Well, why can that be done there? Because they don't have rules against it there. I mean, it is against the World Trade Organization rules, but how often is the World Trade Organization visiting these small countries in Africa where there's mining going on? So they're able to get away with a lot of things that would be illegal in a lot of other countries. Export processing zones are cities that border more developed countries, but they are on the side of the border that is less developed. So this here is a picture of San Diego and Tijuana. Can you tell which is which? San Diego's on the left and Tijuana's on the right. And so Tijuana is a border town that interacts very closely with the United States. So there are a lot of factories around Tijuana, and those factories are called maquiladoras. And I'm sorry if I pronounce it incorrectly for my Spanish speaking students, but I try my best. So, and those factories, they will produce goods for American companies, and the goods will be imported into the United States. So transnational corporations use these areas to cut costs because they are areas that are cities that are in a less developed country, so they have less regulations, less rules, and so it's cheaper to operate the business. They can pay people less, but they are really close to the border, so the transport costs are really low. You need to have your book out. Again, we're going to be looking at page 270, and on page 270, there is a paragraph in the middle of the page called Ethics and Societal Changes Related to EPZs. And it gives the positives and the negatives about these export processing zones. And really, the negatives are kind of limited. The greatest negative is that companies, these rich transnational corporations, are exploiting these workers and paying them low wages. And so that's a big one. The other one is that they are exploiting the environment because there are less stringent rules about things that you can do to the environment, like, polluting the air, polluting the water. There are also maybe different rules about like how young the workers can be. Like it may be okay to hire people who are still school age, that kind of thing. And so there's that exploitation aspect. That's probably their biggest negative. And it is a big negative. I don't want to downplay it. But there's actually a lot of positives too. And a lot of times in social science, we forget about the positives, and it's always good to look at the positives. So, what transnational corporations say, hey, we are providing jobs for people who wouldn't otherwise have a job. And yes, they are paid less than they would be paid in a more developed country, but for where they live, the wages are pretty good. We're also willing to hire women. And a lot of these local factories that are headquartered in the developing country may not want to hire women, but we don't have a problem with women. So, hey, we're going to hire the women. We also might like to hire the women because they're willing to work for less too. There's that aspect as well. But we'll just leave that for another day. And another thing that they do is they are putting money into the economy of that developing country. So that's another positive one. And then birth rates also drop as well. Now, companies aren't saying, hey, we contribute to the declining birth rate and therefore more resources for the people. No, they don't say that. But it is a fact that if women are in the workplace and they have a decent job, they are less likely to be having a lot of children because they don't want to give up their job so that they have to stay home and raise small children. So it does also lead to a decline in the birth rate. Historically, the great industrial area of the United States stretched around the Great Lakes. So the Great Lakes are in the upper Midwest, and I know as Californians, it doesn't sound like, you know, Pennsylvania is the Midwest. That sounds pretty Eastern to us. But actually, it is like Western Pennsylvania is considered the Midwest because that was a terminology that was determined when our country did not stretch from sea to shining sea. It was mainly an East Coast country. So we do refer to that region as the Midwest still. So we're looking at upstate New York, that the area that touches the Great Lakes wraps around to Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Okay, so that is the major industrial region of the United States. And since the I would say 1970s is when it really started, a lot of industries started to move out of that region of the United States. Now, some of them would move to the southern part of the United States, and we'll talk about later more why they moved to the southern part of the United States. Other things they did is they would move overseas for reasons we've talked about in the past, that it was cheaper to operate the businesses overseas. They could start to, transport the goods more quickly as container ships got larger and larger, and so large they could block the Suez Canal. And so it just made sense. And what happened is a lot of these factories that had been really vibrant factories in the United States up until the 1980s started to close one by one. I would say 1970s, early 80s, started to close one by one. And then what you would be left with is what is now called the Rust Belt. So that's kind of like all these old machines are rusting away. They're also called brownfields. So those are the factories themselves. So the belt is that whole region surrounding the Great Lakes. So starting with upstate New York and ending with Minnesota. Okay, so that's the Rust Belt, everything touching the Great Lakes. And then the brownfields are those factories, those abandoned factories in that area. So here's a map for you so you can see. The dark green area is where you're going to have the greatest number of closures, and you can see those are the areas, most of them closest to the Great Lakes. And then the light green areas would be fewer closures, but still plenty of closures. And you can see, let's see if I can get my pointy finger here. Maybe my marker, maybe here. So up right here, that is New York. We tip out at Pennsylvania right here, Ohio. We have Michigan up here, Indiana over here, Illinois, Wisconsin, and then all the way up here is Minnesota. Okay, so this is known as the Upper Midwest. So here is another map of the Upper Midwest, and this is the dominant industries in these today Rust Belt cities. But back in 1950, before they were all rusty, they had all kinds of different industries that were working in this area. And you can see on the side what's there. So obviously administration is not really an industry, but that would be some main offices. And then you have other goods that are produced in these areas. And so these were all major manufacturing cities. These would also be destinations of the Great Migration. So we talked about this in the migration unit, how African Americans in the earlier part of the 20th century would be leaving the southern plantations and sharecropping areas of the South and coming up to the north to look for work because there was a lot of factories open, and they would be looking to go into these cities to get jobs. And in comparison to sharecropping, it was pretty good jobs. And so in these areas, in these cities that you see highlighted, you're also going to have higher numbers of African American population as well that's still there today because of these jobs. However, the jobs are no longer there. And so it is a really sad situation for people who grew up in these areas and worked in manufacturing, and now manufacturing's gone and they're wondering what it is exactly that they're supposed to do. Most people who once upon a time worked in the secondary sector aren't finding equal pay in the tertiary sector. A lot of them don't have college degrees, and so they're relegated to jobs that don't pay very well. And while in California, minimum wage is a little higher than in the other states, it's like $12 an hour. A lot of these states, it's still the federal minimum wage, which is $7 an hour. And imagine making that after you'd made like $50 an hour. It's very difficult for these cities. And remember, brownfields and Rust Belt, those are two terms you need to know in association with these cities. So two styles of businesses that you're often going to find in your suburban areas. If you look around where we live, both of these exist. The one that is more common is on, at least for our area, is on the right, where you have these local industrial parks. So think about over where Costco is and Amazon is. I mean, that's just a huge industrial park. Most of these industrial parks are not built for people to be walking around in them. Like if you think about like the Costco parking lot, it's not meant for strolling and relaxation, right? It is very like bring your car in, get your stuff, and leave. It's all about the vehicle. And if you look at the backside of the Amazon warehouse on the freeway, there's like all these different like truck bays. It's all about driving and it's all about the vehicle, okay? Whereas there's another style of business which is called the corporate park. And the corporate park is supposed to be a little more human friendly. A lot of times they will have green spaces. A lot of times businesses that are more human centered will locate here rather than business centered. So maybe like a doctor's office or, you know, some place where humans are going to go pick something up, not where vehicles like trucks are going to go pick something up. So the corporate park is that other style. So you can find both of these here. Chances are your doctor's office is in something that looks similar to a corporate park. So Google is a really big business, and it is up in Menlo Park, California, which is kind of in the San Francisco Bay Area. And they are known for their corporate park because they do a really nice job trying to make it so it's a kind of a user-friendly place to be. Like I've actually heard there's like playgrounds for adults and all kinds of stuff like that. And so, and their corporate park has green space, and it's just, you know, you're not going to have trucks driving through the middle of this thing. So that's basically what you need to point out here. Also, another thing you would notice is that they do have a lot of solar panels. So Google has been really proud of the fact that they have been implementing the use of solar panels for a number of years, I think since like 2011 or something. So they've been using it for a long time. Okay, so we just talked about Google and Menlo Park. That is part of Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is what is known as a technopole. There are technopoles for all kinds of industries, but Silicon Valley is a technopole for the computer industry. And so we have a few different ones. So Boston is a technopole, North Carolina, Ontario, Canada. And so these are all places where people who get degrees in computer engineering or computer science, this is where they're going to go to seek jobs. So the positives of a technopole, you're going to know where you're going to want to look for a job, right? If you've got one of these degrees, you're going to like have an idea of where you want to go. You're also going to have a lot of support industries for the computer industry. You're going to have colleges in those areas that are specializing in feeding those industries. So it's going to, you're going to have this cluster of businesses that actually improve efficiency. The downside is that you don't end up with computer engineers all over. So there's this like brain drain in other areas. Whereas like, you know, some country town, a kid grows up and he's a computer engineer, he's probably not going to stay in his country town. Now, this may all change because of COVID, and people have learned that remote work is something that can definitely be done, and people can really work from anywhere. So that may change, but as of now, if you want to go places in the computer industry, you're going to check out one of these spots. I feel like Austin, Texas should be here too. It's not, but I feel like it should be. So we're going to take a look at page 272 using our book once again. Okay, so on page 272, it is telling us some of the desired side effects of a technopole, like why do they develop the way they do? Obviously, things happen for a reason. So why did they develop the way they do? And then the unwanted side effects, like what are the problems? What are the big problems with having, you know, certain places where technology happens? So they happen primarily because you end up with these universities that specialize in computer technology in those specific areas. So that's really the launch pad for the technopole. And then they end up being really strong growth centers. So, you know, like Silicon Valley, what has made computers and computer engineering such a strong industry in our country is the fact that we do have these clusters. So it has really allowed the growth of these businesses, and it's, you know, been really, really great for our overall gross domestic product. But then again, what are the unwanted side effects or the negative benefits? Some of those are that, you know, like I said, the last slide, you are getting people from other areas coming to work there. So it's kind of like siphoning off all the really talented techie people from being all over the country or even all over the world. So we're brain draining people from all over the world to come to these places. Oh, I forgot to mention another desired side effect is that these places can be a magnet for even more businesses. So even more businesses open up. They become such a vibrant economy. Another downside though is because they have such a vibrant economy, the property becomes very expensive in these areas. So people who live in these areas often cannot afford housing. So if you're, for example, a teacher in Silicon Valley, you're going to really struggle because teachers typically don't get paid a ton of money. They get paid a living wage depending on where they live in the country, usually enough to get by for sure. But in Silicon Valley, it may not be enough to get by because, a one bedroom apartment is going to cost you $5,000 a month. And, if that's your entire salary, how are you going to live? So that is a really unwanted side effect. Businesses want to operate in a country where the government is really strong and stable. So it's really important that a country can maintain stability. And when people start talking about, oh, this government's so messed up, we need to overthrow it, it would just all be better if we had a different government. Not necessarily. Now, obviously, that depends on the government. But usually it's not. I mean, the more unstable things are, the harder it is for businesses to come in and run, and therefore the less profit that is made, the less jobs that are available. Really, stability is super important to the entire economy. And so governments obviously need to develop stability, but they do other things as well. So they try to get businesses to come and set up in their state or their country. And so sometimes what they do is they give tax breaks for businesses. So like we're famous for doing that in our country. And you may have heard some like news reports that talk about some of the biggest companies in the United States paid zero taxes, like Nike and Amazon. And you're wondering, how is that possible? They're so rich. And one of the reasons is to try to get businesses to promote them to set up in their state or their country. Countries will give them tax breaks. And because they know that if they don't give them a tax break, they'll go somewhere else. So they do. They give them tax breaks. They also give loans to businesses. And sometimes they're forgivable loans, meaning that they never intend to get the money back. So this happens all of the time. This has definitely happened with COVID, where the government has just given money to businesses. Like, here you go. I hope it works out for you. Here's some money. That happens all the time. Sometimes they do direct assistance where they are giving the use of land or buildings for free of charge. This happens with the ballparks. So most of the stadiums, they're owned by city governments, but then baseball teams and football teams will play in them a lot of times for free of charge. And you might be asking, like, why do they do that? Because obviously the NBA and the NFL and all of these, they're really rich. Like, why is a city going to let a team operate there? Well, they do it to bring in other revenue, to bring in jobs to the area and other revenue. So revenue is money. So, like, for example, if you build a stadium and, they have games there all the time, then other businesses are going to open around that stadium because they're going to want to get that spill off. Like when the fans are coming to the stadium and leaving in the stadium, they stop at the restaurant. So that is why cities and states and, they will foot the bill on these really big businesses. Okay. And then they also sometimes will change regulations. So they can make it so unions can't set up. So a union is when the the employees decide they want to join together and they want to go on strike if the employer isn't treating them well. So a government can make laws so that workers cannot really unionize, and that's happened in much of the southern part of the United States. And then also they can reduce environmental rules. So this is a biggie in Texas where they pretty much don't really enforce as many environmental rules as other states. They have the real hands off. Like, go ahead, pollute. Who cares? It's a big state. It'll be fine. And so they do that so that companies will move to their state. And definitely a lot of California companies have moved to Texas for that reason. They have lower taxes on the company. They give tax breaks to the company. And then they also say, we don't really have any rules here. We're Texas. Okay. So that's another thing they do. So this is a little graph that shows the GDP by country and then also by continent. And so you can see that we have in yellow, we have Asia, in red, we have North America, in green, we have Europe, in light blue, we have South America, in dark blue, we have Australia, and then in medium blue, we have Africa, and then in purple, rest of the world. Okay, so the biggest slice, it looks like it is probably, I'd have to add them all up, but it looks like it might be Asia is bigger than the North American slice, biggest slice. But the United States has the largest slice when it comes to each individual country. So as of right now, the United States does have the largest GDP. So GDP is gross domestic product, which is the total amount of money made on all goods and services within that country. So, a lot of Americans, and I've talked to you guys about this before, Americans talk about, oh, China is like eating us for lunch, and, yeah, no, they're not. I mean, they're growing really, really fast, but they're not larger than the United States as far as GDP. Not yet. They are definitely outpacing the United States, but they had a lot of room to grow. So it made a lot of sense that they would grow once they changed their economic policies, that they would grow like they did. It really made a lot of sense. Okay, guys, you should be doing this for every chapter. A lot of you've been asking me, like, what can I do to prepare for the exam? Well, everything that I give you is to prepare for the exam. And definitely use this book. This book that we use in class is an exam prep book. That's what it is. The reason I use this book as opposed to the textbook that the school gives us is because this book is designed for exam prep. The other book's wonderful. It has great pictures, but it's not an exam prep book, so it's not as narrowly defined. So what I would say, every time we do a chapter, you've got to make sure you can define the terms on page 274. I have made a Quizlet for that, so you should be reviewing those definitely. You should answer the multiple choice questions. If you're not sure about the multiple choice questions, look in the book and try to find the answers. They're all there. Now, I know that some of the questions are a little harder to figure out the answers than others, but take a look, okay? And then also answer the FRQ. So this one, I will be making an assignment. I'm not making an assignment for the multiple choice questions. I am making an assignment for the FRQ. You should be making an outline, notes before answering, and then answer those FRQs in complete sentences. So I will be making an assignment for the FRQ. But the multiple choice, that's just something you could work on your own. And I know other students have been asking about like Mr. Sin's like grand review or whatever. I got my own grand review, guys. You don't have to buy Mr. Sin's. I mean, if you want to buy Mr. Sin's, you can, if it makes you feel good, but you don't have to. You definitely don't have to. Okay, so I will be making an assignment for the FRQ, but the other things are suggestions of things that you can do to make sure that you're prepared and you understand. Okay, bye guys.